Welcome to our next video in our series on navigating conversations. In this video, we'll be talking about how to navigate difficult conversations in a one-on-one setting. Generally, what makes a conversation difficult is one of three things. 1, the stakes are high, so the topic matters. 2, the emotions are high. We have strong feelings about the topic we're discussing. Or 3, we have a difference of opinion regarding the topic. Now, just a disclaimer before we start. Talking about how to navigate difficult conversations is a whole lot easier than actually navigating difficult conversations. It's one thing to practice it in theory, it's another thing to practice these techniques when the stakes are high, the emotions are high, and you have a difference of opinion on things. It's kind of similar to the fruit of the Spirit. I might think of myself as a patient and kind person, but am I actually patient when my patience is tested? Am I actually kind when someone has been unkind to me? That's when my character is actually tested and revealed. So as we talk about how to navigate difficult conversations, keep these principles in mind, but remember that it takes practice and self-awareness to put these principles into practice consistently. Let's consider some things to think about before the difficult conversation takes place, if possible. First, consider what's at stake. Is this conversation worth having? What is your relationship with the other person? Have you built a foundation of trust in order to be able to have that conversation with this person? Can your relationship handle the conversation? Would you risk the relationship for this conversation? And are you the right person to be having this conversation with the other person? Is the other person a believer or an unbeliever? And if they're a believer, how strong is their faith? Romans 14:1 says, "As for one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions." Next, how important is this issue? Within the church, we can categorize issues in one of three ways. The first is primary issues. Those are issues that are essential to the doctrine of the Christian faith. Those would be things like the Trinity, Jesus being fully God and fully man, the authority of Scripture. Secondary issues would be issues that Christians might disagree about. Those are generally the issues that account for denominational differences. Lastly, we have the tertiary issues, and those reflect just a difference of opinion or preference. Those might be things such as worship style preference or your view on end time events. So think about whether or not this conversation will promote unity or division. Next, is this an issue that needs to be discussed? Use wisdom as to whether or not to even participate in the conversation. Can this issue be genuinely overlooked by being gracious, kind, or forgiving? Or will resentment build if the issue isn't addressed? Some difficult conversations are worth having. Being a peacemaker means resolving conflict, not avoiding conflict. When we avoid conflict, that has a negative effect on our relationships. But other conversations do not need to be entered into. For example, if someone says something just to upset you, you don't need to take the bait. Titus 3:9 says, "Avoid foolish controversies, for they are unprofitable and worthless." And 1 Timothy 6:4 warns against people who have an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction among people. You don't need to participate in every conversation you're invited to. Next, prepare ahead of time for the conversation. We want to respond rather than to react. So first, consider the appropriate timing and setting of the conversation. Is this the best time and place? If, for example, the other person has had a really stressful day at work, that might not be the best time to address the issue. Or if you're in a public setting and this conversation would really require a more private setting, then you might need to wait to have the conversation. Next, think about what your desired outcome is for the conversation. What do you want to happen as a result of this conversation? Are you wanting to hear and understand each other? Are you willing to consider a viewpoint other than your own? Or are you trying to change the other person's mind about something? And if that's your goal, think about how often that really works. Lives aren't usually changed through arguments or proving someone else wrong. Instead, lives are changed when something makes somebody question their own thinking on something. So ideas are like seeds that are planted and grow over time. Shifts in thought usually happen so gradually that a person might not even realize it. Growth is often slow and barely visible in the moment. So once you know your goal for the conversation, think about what attitude and behavior you can bring to the conversation in order to help make that goal happen. And again, we want to think about the fruit of the Spirit. So think about how those qualities impact a conversation. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Now think about what the opposite qualities, how those things would affect a conversation. Those would be things like indifference, despair, anxiety, impatience, rudeness, meanness, selfishness, harshness, and rashness. Which conversation would you rather be a part of? And how can you bring the fruit of the Spirit to the conversation? 2 more questions to think about before the conversation. 1, what assumptions am I making? Really think about what you are assuming to be true about the other person or about what they think. And then question yourself, is that actually true? Do I actually know that to be true about the other person? Next, think about what could go wrong. And the reason you do that is because you can think ahead of time about what you can do in order to help prevent that. So for example, if what might go wrong would be that the other person would become defensive, how can I approach the situation in order to help them not become defensive? Those are some things to consider ahead of time if you're able to. Here are some things to keep in mind during the conversation. So first, remember empathy. We talked about empathy in our video on general conversation skills, but empathy is even more important when you're navigating a difficult conversation. So we want to remember to listen to understand, clarify instead of making assumptions, and communicate understanding so the other person feels heard and understood. Next, remember that the person in front of you is made in the image of God. They are loved by God and someone God has called you to love. We are called to love our brothers and sisters in Christ, our neighbors, and our enemies. So there's no one we're not called to love. Next, begin with an attitude of humility. Humility is the opposite of pride and arrogance, but it's not the same thing as low self-esteem or a lack of confidence. It's actually thinking rightly about yourself. It's understanding your strengths and gifts, as well as your flaws and limitations. We all tend to think we're right about what we think, but in reality, none of us thinks perfectly, and we're all wrong about something. And we often don't even know what we're wrong about. And that's true of us and of the person that we're talking to. So have an attitude of humility that is willing to learn from this conversation. Next, replace judgment with curiosity. Have an attitude of calm curiosity for this conversation. Another person's beliefs are not an attack against us. And having that understanding allows us to relate with compassion and curiosity rather than judgment and defensiveness. Next, remember that our attitude and our actions in the conversation reflect our character. Our character is tested not so much when we're around people who think like us and believe like we do, but it's tested when we're around people who think differently than we do, or people who are challenging to us. That's when our character is tested and when we really need to put into practice the fruit of the Spirit that we've been talking about. Regardless of how the other person acts, I'm responsible for how I act in the conversation. How do I treat this person that I disagree with, or that may be treating me poorly? That reveals my character. That leads us to our next point. Be patient and be gracious. In a previous video, we talked about the negative effects that technology has had on conversation. One benefit of communicating through technology is that we have the opportunity to put our words in writing before saying them. So we have the opportunity to choose our words and consider our response ahead of time. That doesn't necessarily happen in in-person conversations. Who we really are is revealed in the unedited, unpolished conversations. So that means we might misspeak or word something maybe a little less tactfully than we would if we had the opportunity to think about it ahead of time. That's especially true in difficult conversations when the emotions are high, the stakes are high, and we have differences of opinion. And so we need to be extra gracious with one another and extra patient with one another and give people the benefit of the doubt. Assume the best about someone else's intentions. Forgiveness actually starts with not being easily offended in the first place. When we're easily offended, that is a surefire way for a conversation to shut down. Lastly, think about connection before correction. We want to make sure we've connected with the person and truly understood them well before offering any type of counsel or correction. So start with empathy and listening to understand their perspective and their experiences. There are a couple proverbs that speak to this. Proverbs 18:13 says, "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame." And then on the flip side, Proverbs 20 verse 5 says, "The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out." Sometimes when people have strong beliefs about a subject, it is because they have either a personal experience with the topic or that topic has affected someone that they love. Sometimes their thoughts on a topic have more to do with their personal experiences than maybe what they would think about it from a theoretical or logical perspective. And so it's important to ask some questions about how they came to feel or think the way they do about the topic. You might discover that they've been personally impacted by the topic. So seek to understand first. When there are opportunities to speak scriptural truth, pray for wisdom real quick and speak with grace, compassion, and tenderness. When in doubt, err on the side of grace. If the person feels heard and respected, you may have an opportunity for more conversation in the future. Think of a time when you had to say something difficult to somebody else. Maybe you needed to confess something, or maybe you needed to say that you were hurt by something that they said or did. How did that other person respond? Did they respond well, or did they respond poorly? Did they listen? Did they have compassion? Or were they defensive or judgmental? You can probably think of examples of both. Times that you were received well and the grace that was shown to you, and times when you weren't. That can make all the difference for how that conversation goes, as well as how future conversations go. And we get to do that and be that for somebody else. When we receive something well, we're building trust for future conversations. We've talked about a lot of things in this video series. James 1:19 actually summarizes all of this really well when it says, "Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Today, being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry are pretty countercultural, and it's a great way for us to demonstrate the love of Jesus to the world around us. Let's go out and practice.